The sterile, predictable opulence of the grand ballroom had long since lost its charm for Julian Croft. He stood by a marble column, a glass of untouched champagne in his hand, a ghost at a feast of his own making. The annual Croft Foundation Charity Gala was the glittering pinnacle of the city's social calendar, a night where the elite paid exorbitant sums to feel virtuous, and Julian paid the price of his own past by enduring it. He adjusted the knot of his silk tie, the fabric a soft prison against his throat. Each clink of crystal, each burst of manufactured laughter, felt like a stone thrown into the silent, bottomless well of his grief. 5 years. 5 years since the world had stolen the sun from his sky, leaving only the cold, distant starlight of his fortune. The auctioneer, a man with a voice as smooth and polished as the mahogany gavel in his hand, was moving on to the final lot of the evening. "And now, ladies and gentlemen," he boomed, his voice echoing slightly in the cavernous room, "we have a truly unique item, a donation from the heart, a symbol of hope from a child at the St. Jude's Orphanage, Lot 77. On the massive screen behind the stage, an image appeared. It wasn't a jewel, a piece of art, or an exotic vacation. It was a small silver locket, tarnished with age, its chain a delicate, broken thread. The camera zoomed in, pushing past the dents and scratches to the tiny photograph nestled within one of its hearts. Julian's breath hitched. The air in his lungs turned to ice, then to fire. His carefully constructed facade, the armor of detached elegance he had worn for half a decade, shattered into a million pieces. The champagne flute slipped from his numb fingers, crashing against the parquet floor, in a symphony of destruction that no one but him seemed to hear. On the screen, staring out with a gap-toothed grin and eyes that held all the light in the universe, was his son, Leo, his lost boy. The auctioneer's voice became a dull, meaningless drone. Julian's world had narrowed to that single, impossible image. His heart, a dormant volcano, erupted with a force that threatened to tear him apart. He took a staggering step forward, his hand outstretched as if he could pluck the image from the air. "Where?" he rasped, his voice a raw, broken thing he didn't recognize. "Did you get that?" The room fell silent. Every eye turned to the billionaire, the city's stoic titan, now a man unraveling at the seams. On the screen, the image changed, replaced by the donor. A little girl with neat blonde hair and wide, questioning blue eyes, holding the locket in her small hands. "Her name is Lily," the auctioneer stammered, caught off guard. "She said it was her most prized possession. She wanted it to help the other children." Julian didn't hear him. He saw only the girl, a stranger, holding the last piece of his soul in her hands. The world tilted on its axis, a whirlwind of confusion, rage, and a terrifying, fragile flicker of something he hadn't felt in 5 years. Hope. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, until Julian's voice cut through it, sharp and commanding, a king addressing a world that had suddenly become his enemy territory. "Stop the auction. I want to see her. Now." The drive to the orphanage was a blur of rain-slicked streets and the frantic, rhythmic thump of the limousine's windshield wipers, each sweep a futile attempt to clear the storm, raging inside him. His assistant, a perpetually flustered man named Arthur, sat silently in the opposite seat, wisely sensing that any attempt at consolation would be met with a glacial wall of fury. St. Jude's was a relic of a bygone era, a formidable brick building whose Gothic revival architecture seemed more suited to a ghost story than a children's home. It stood in a part of the city Julian's car normally only passed through on the way to the airport, a world away from his penthouse that scraped the clouds. The air inside was thick with the smell of disinfectant, boiled vegetables, and something else, something less tangible. The scent of institutionalized loneliness. A stout, weary-looking woman with kind eyes and a nameplate that read Mrs. Gable met him in the entryway. She had clearly been roused from her evening routine, her floral cardigan buttoned askew. "Mr. Croft," she began, her voice a mixture of awe and apprehension. "We are honored, of course, but it's very late for the children." Julian cut her off, his voice devoid of its usual polished courtesy. "The girl, Lily, the one with the locket." Mrs. Gable wrung her hands. "Lily is a very sweet, very sensitive child. I don't want her frightened." "I won't frighten her," Julian clipped, though he wasn't sure it was a promise he could keep. He felt like a predator, stalking a clue that might lead him back to his life, and he was aware of the immense, unfair power dynamic at play. He, a man who could buy and sell entire city blocks, was about to interrogate a 7-year-old girl over a photograph. He was led down a long, dimly lit corridor. The walls were lined with children's drawings, vibrant, chaotic bursts of color that stood in stark contrast to the muted greens and beiges of the institution. He could hear the faint murmur of a television and the distant sound of a child coughing. They stopped before a small, sparsely furnished room that served as a makeshift sitting area. And there she was. She was smaller in person than she had appeared on the screen, a delicate little thing perched on the edge of a worn floral armchair, her legs not quite reaching the floor. She wore simple pink pajamas adorned with faded cartoon swans. Her blonde hair was clean and neatly brushed, a testament to the care of the staff. But her eyes, a startlingly clear blue, held a watchfulness that didn't belong on a child's face. She clutched a threadbare teddy bear with one button eye to her chest. She looked at him, then at Mrs. Gable, then back at him, her expression a mixture of curiosity and a deep, ingrained caution. Julian's resolve faltered. This was not a clue. This was a child. A tiny, vulnerable human being. He forced himself to take a breath, to soften the hard lines of his face. He crouched down, an unfamiliar and awkward position in his bespoke suit, to bring himself closer to her level. "Hello, Lily," he said, his voice softer than he intended. "My name is Julian." She didn't respond, just tightened her grip on the bear. Mrs. Gable gave her a gentle, encouraging smile. "It's all right, dear. Mr. Croft just wants to ask you about the pretty locket you donated." At the mention of the locket, Lily's expression changed. A small, almost imperceptible light flickered in her eyes. "You liked it?" she asked, her voice a soft, whispery thing. Yes," Julian said, the word catching in his throat. "It's very special. The boy in the photograph, do you know who he is?" Lily's face broke into a genuine, radiant smile that transformed her. The wariness vanished, replaced by a pure, unadulterated joy that struck Julian with the force of a physical blow. "That's Leo," she said, as if introducing her closest friend. "He's my guardian angel." Julian's carefully controlled composure cracked. "You're... what? Who told you that?" "Nobody," she said, shaking her head, her blonde hair swishing against her small shoulders. "I just know. He looks after me. He's always been with me." The words made no sense. They were the fanciful imaginings of a lonely child, and yet they pierced him to the core. "Lily, where did you get the locket?" he asked, his voice strained. "It was in my blanket," she said simply. "The one I came with." "Came with?" Mrs. Gable interjected softly. "Lily was a foundling, Mr. Croft. She was left on our steps 3 years ago. All she had was a small, hand-knitted blanket and the clothes she was wearing. The locket was tucked deep inside the folds. We kept it safe for her until she was old enough to understand." 3 years ago. Leo had disappeared 5 years ago. The timeline didn't add up, a chaotic jumble of dates and events that only deepened the mystery. "Can I see it?" Julian asked, his gaze fixed on the child. The blanket? Mrs. Gable nodded and bustled out of the room. Julian was left alone with the girl and her one-eyed bear. The silence was heavy, filled with the unspoken questions that hung between the billionaire who had lost everything and the orphan who had nothing. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw the profound loneliness in her eyes, a reflection of the same gaping void that resided in his own heart. She was a child clinging to the image of his son for comfort, a boy she'd never met, weaving a fantasy of a guardian angel to protect her from the harsh realities of her world. The thought was both beautiful and agonizingly sad. Mrs. Gable returned with a small, folded bundle of yarn. It was a pale yellow, faded and frayed from years of love. The knitting was simple, uneven in places, clearly the work of an amateur. Julian took it from her, his hands trembling slightly. The wool was soft, worn smooth. He ran his fingers over the threads, a desperate tactile search for an answer, a connection. Anything. As he unfolded it, a faint, almost imperceptible scent rose from the fabric, the ghost of a baby powder he hadn't smelled in 5 years. And there, stitched into the corner with clumsy, uneven letters, was a single, faded initial. L. Not for Lily, for Leo. His wife had stitched that initial into her son's favorite blanket, a week before he vanished. He sank onto the edge of a nearby chair, the blanket clutched in his hand, the room swimming before his eyes. It was Leo's. There was no doubt. This little girl, this stranger, had been wrapped in the last tangible piece of his son's childhood. The questions multiplied, a raging torrent in his mind. Who had left her here? Why did she have Leo's blanket? And the most terrifying, hopeful question of all, where was his son? The little girl watched him, her head tilted. She slipped off the chair and padded over to him, her bare feet silent on the linoleum floor. She reached out a small, hesitant hand and patted his knee. "Are you sad, Mr. Julian?" she whispered. "Leo doesn't like it when people are sad." Julian looked down at her, at the impossible, innocent sincerity in her face. He couldn't speak. He could only nod, a single, jerky movement. The dam of his grief, so carefully constructed over 5 long years, was beginning to crumble, worn away by the gentle, persistent presence of a little girl with his son's photograph and a story that made no sense at all. The next morning, Julian's penthouse, usually a sanctuary of minimalist order and quiet solitude, was transformed into a command center. He hadn't slept. The image of Lily's earnest face and the feel of Leo's blanket were seared into his mind. Arthur had, at Julian's terse command, summoned the best private investigator money could buy. Clara Sterling was not what he had expected. She was a woman in her late 40s with sharp, intelligent eyes, a no-nonsense demeanor, and a leather jacket that looked like it had seen its fair share of life. She didn't seem impressed by the panoramic city views or the museum-quality art on his walls. She sat across from him at his glass dining table, a tablet and a steaming mug of black coffee in front of her, and listened without interruption as he recounted the events of the previous night. She examined the blanket which he had placed on the table between them like a sacred relic, with a professional detachment that Julian found both irritating and reassuring. "The initial is hand-stitched," she observed, her finger tracing the faded L. "The yarn is a common merino wool, traceable, but not easily. The blanket itself, however, the pattern is unique, not a standard knit. It has a specific double-looping technique on the edges. That's a signature. A habit. We can work with that." Her confidence was a small anchor in his sea of turmoil. "The girl, Lily," he pressed. "She was found 3 years ago. My son disappeared 5 years ago." "How is that possible?" "People and things don't always travel in straight lines, Mr. Croft," Clara said, her eyes meeting his. "Leo was taken. The person who took him may have acquired the blanket." That person may have later come into contact with Lily, or there's a more direct connection we're not seeing yet. We start with the blanket and the girl, the only two concrete things we have. We trace them back. Tell me about the day Leo disappeared. Julian flinched. It was a wound he never touched, a door he kept perpetually locked. Reliving it was a form of torture, but for the first time in 5 years there was a reason to. He spoke, his voice low and strained, painting a picture of a perfect autumn afternoon in the park, the scent of wood smoke and damp earth, the brilliant gold of the maple leaves. He described Leo's laughter, a sound he could still hear in the dead of night as he chased a red ball across the grass. He remembered turning away for just a moment, a single, unforgivable moment, to answer a phone call. When he turned back, the red ball lay still in the grass, and Leo was gone. The police investigation had been massive, a media frenzy that had turned his private tragedy into a public spectacle. There were no witnesses, no ransom note, no credible leads. Just a void where his son used to be. His marriage had crumbled under the weight of the grief and guilt. A slow, silent death that had ended a year later with his wife moving to Europe, unable to bear the constant reminders in the city where she had lost her child. He was left alone with his empire and the ghost of a laughing boy. Clara listened, her expression unreadable. When he finished, she didn't offer empty platitudes or condolences. She simply tapped her pen on her tablet. Okay, the park. We'll start there again. Not the police version. My version. We look at every employee, every vendor, every complaint filed that month. We re-interview everyone, not as a 5-year-old cold case, but as an active investigation. Something was missed. Something always is. Her pragmatism was a cold, clean relief. She was a professional treating a problem, not a wound. What about the girl? Julian asked. I can't just leave her there. You're going to have to. For now, Clara said firmly. Your presence there will attract attention. The media will descend on that orphanage like vultures if they get a whiff of this. It will compromise the investigation, and more importantly, it will terrify the child who is currently our only link. Let me work. I'll put a discreet surveillance team on the orphanage just to monitor who comes and goes. But you need to stay away. The command grated against every fiber of his being. Staying away felt like a betrayal, an abandonment of this fragile, nascent hope. But he saw the logic in her words. He nodded, the movement stiff. Find something, Ms. Sterling, whatever it costs. I will, she said, gathering her things. And Mr. Croft? Try to get some sleep. You look like hell. After she left, the silence of the penthouse pressed in on him. He walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the city sprawling beneath him. It was his kingdom, a world he could command with a single phone call, yet he was powerless to find one small boy. He picked up the yellow blanket and held it to his face, inhaling the faint scent that remained. He felt a profound, aching connection to the little girl in the orphanage. She had slept with this, found comfort in it, just as he was doing now. They were two strangers, a billionaire and a foundling, bound together by a lost boy and a thread of yarn. The days that followed were an exercise in excruciating patience. Julian tried to work, to immerse himself in the familiar world of mergers and acquisitions, but his focus was shattered. Every spreadsheet blurred, every conference call was a meaningless buzz in his ear. His world had shrunk to the size of his phone, waiting for a call from Clara that never seemed to come. He found himself thinking constantly of Lily. He imagined her in the sterile environment of the orphanage, eating her meals in a noisy cafeteria, sleeping in a room full of other children, clutching her one-eyed bear. He remembered her small hand on his knee, her quiet question, "Are you sad?" He felt an irrational urge to protect her, to swoop in and spirit her away from that place of institutional grayness, and place her in a world of color and warmth. It was a foolish, sentimental notion, and he knew it. He was projecting his feelings for his lost son onto this strange little girl. Or was he? He couldn't deny the genuine connection he had felt in that small, shabby room. Clara's updates, when they came, were methodical and frustratingly incremental. She had identified the specific batch of merino wool used for the blanket, tracing it to a small, family-owned yarn shop in a town 3 hours north of the city. The shop had closed down 4 years ago. The owner had passed away. Clara was now painstakingly tracking down old sales ledgers from the man's estate. It was slow, tedious work. A week after their first meeting, Julian couldn't stand it anymore. He broke his promise. He told Arthur to clear his schedule and drive him to St. Jude's, using a discreet back entrance he'd had his security team map out. He arrived unannounced in the middle of the afternoon, armed with a ridiculously large, brightly wrapped gift bag. Mrs. Gable met him with a look of gentle disapproval. "Mr. Croft, I'm not sure this is wise. I'll only be a few minutes," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Is she?" "She's in the garden with the other children." Mrs. Gable sighed, resigning herself to the situation. The garden was a small paved yard, with a few hardy-looking flower beds and a sturdy swing set. Lily was sitting by herself on a wooden bench, not playing with the other children who were chasing a soccer ball nearby. She was talking quietly to her teddy bear, which was propped up next to her. Julian's heart contracted. He walked over slowly, the gift bag crinkling in his hand. She looked up as his shadow fell over her. Her eyes widened slightly in recognition. "Mr. Julian," she said, a small note of surprise in her voice. "Hello, Lily," he said, sitting down on the other end of the bench. He felt absurdly self-conscious. "I brought you something." He placed the bag between them. She eyed it with a child's natural curiosity, but made no move to open it. "Why?" she asked. "Because you gave away your most prized possession," he said softly. "I thought you should have something to replace it." She looked down at her bear. "Barnaby isn't a replacement. He's my best friend." "I see," Julian said, feeling foolish. He had tried to solve a problem with money, his default setting. He had brought a gift, an object, when what she probably wanted was something else entirely. "What are you and Barnaby talking about?" he asked, changing tactics. "I'm telling him about Leo," she said, her expression serious. "I'm telling him that Leo is going to find his daddy." The innocence of her statement was like a punch to the gut. She had woven the reality of his grief into her fantasy. "What makes you think that?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Because daddies are supposed to find their little boys," she said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "That's their job." They sat in silence for a moment, the sounds of the children playing in the background, a cheerful counterpoint to the weight of their conversation. Lily finally reached for the gift bag. She carefully untied the ribbon and peeled back the tissue paper. Inside was a collection of things his personal shopper had assured him a 7-year-old girl would love. A beautifully illustrated book of fairy tales, a set of expensive art supplies, and a doll with lifelike features and a wardrobe of tiny, elaborate dresses. Lily looked at them all, her expression polite but distant. She picked up the book and traced the gold-leaf title with her finger. Then she looked back up at him. "Will you read it to me?" she asked. It was the last thing he expected. He hadn't read a children's book in 5 years. The memory of sitting on Leo's bed, his son's small, warm body curled against his side, was a fresh wave of pain. But he couldn't refuse her. "Of course," he said. He opened the book to the first page, The Tale of the Swan Princess, and began to read. His voice was rusty at first, unaccustomed to the rhythms of fairy tales, but as he continued, something shifted. The noisy playground seemed to fade away. It was just him and this little girl on a bench, lost in a world of enchanted forests and talking animals. He watched her face as he read. She was completely captivated, her blue eyes wide, her lips slightly parted. For those few minutes, she wasn't an orphan in a paved yard. She was a child, pure and simple, lost in the magic of a story. He realized with a jolt that he wasn't just reading to her, he was connecting with her. He was giving her something that had nothing to do with his wealth or his power. He was giving her his time, his attention. When he finished the first story, she leaned her head against his arm, a small, trusting gesture that sent a tremor through him. "Thank you, Mr. Julian," she whispered. "That was better than the doll." He stayed for another hour, reading story after story until his throat was hoarse and the sun began to dip below the high brick walls of the orphanage. As he was leaving, Mrs. Gable caught him at the door. "She hasn't spoken that much in weeks," the woman said, her kind eyes studying him. "She carries a sadness that's too big for her. Whatever you're searching for, Mr. Croft, I think you're helping her find something, too." Driving back to his empty penthouse, Julian felt a profound shift within him. His visit to the orphanage hadn't been about finding a clue or pushing the investigation forward. It had started that way, but it had become something else. He had gone to get information from Lily, but he had ended up giving a piece of himself. And in return, she had given him a moment of peace, a brief respite from the gnawing grief that was his constant companion. He was beginning to understand that his journey and Lily's were intertwined in a way that went far beyond a lost locket and a faded blanket. He was searching for his son, but he was also, slowly and unexpectedly, finding a part of himself he thought was gone forever. Clara Sterling called 3 days later. "I've got something," she said, her voice crisp and professional over the phone. "The sales ledgers from the yarn shop. It took forever to piece them together, they were a mess, but I found it. A bulk purchase of the specific yellow merino wool made 5.5 years ago. The buyer was a woman named Maria Flores." Julian's heart hammered against his ribs. "Is there an address?" "There is," Clara said, "but it's not good. She lived in a low-income housing complex that was torn down 2 years ago to make way for a freeway extension. The residents were scattered. She's not at her last known address. She's off the grid." "So it's a dead end," Julian said, the flicker of hope dimming. "Not yet. I'm running her name through every database I have access to. DMV, credit reports, social services, criminal records. If she's used her name anywhere in the last 5 years, I'll find her. But there's something else. I went back to the old park records, like I said I would. I found a complaint, filed a week before Leo disappeared. A woman reported another woman for odd behavior. Said she was spending hours just watching the children, not interacting with anyone. The reporting officer logged it, but nothing came of it. The description of the woman matches the DMV photo I have of Maria Flores." A cold dread washed over Julian. This wasn't just a random connection anymore. This woman, Maria, had been at the park. She had been watching. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying it's starting to look like she targeted him." "Mr. Croft," Clara said, her voice softening slightly. "This wasn't random. It was planned." The thought was sickening. The idea of his son being stalked, chosen. It was a new layer of horror. He had always imagined it as a crime of opportunity, a fleeting, terrible moment. This was something far more sinister. He spent the rest of the day pacing his apartment, the city views offering no comfort. The investigation had taken a dark turn, and it was leading him further into a past he couldn't bear to face. His visits to Lily became his only solace. He went every other day, always in the afternoon, always with a new book. Their reading sessions on the garden bench became a quiet ritual. He learned about her small world, her favorite teacher, her dislike of carrots, her fear of thunderstorms. She, in turn, learned about him, asking innocent but perceptive questions. "Why is your house so big if you live all alone?" she'd asked one day. "It's quiet," he'd answered, the inadequacy of the word hanging in the air. "I don't like quiet," she'd replied, squeezing Barnaby the bear. "It's too loud." He knew exactly what she meant. He started to notice small things about her, the way she would meticulously smooth out the pages of a book after they'd finished reading, the fierce protectiveness she showed for her one-eyed bear, the way she would hum a tuneless little song to herself when she thought no one was listening. He saw a resilience in her, a strength that had been forged in the fires of abandonment. She was a survivor. One afternoon, as a light rain began to fall, they moved their reading session to a small, drafty sunroom inside the orphanage. He was reading a story about a lost star looking for its constellation when Lily suddenly interrupted him. "Leo's star is lost too," she said, her voice small. Julian paused, the book resting in his hands. "What do you mean, Lily?" "His mommy and daddy are a constellation," she explained, her 7-year-old logic perfectly clear in her own mind. "And he's a little star that fell out. He's trying to find his way back." The simple, poignant metaphor was so accurate it took his breath away. "How do you know so much about him?" he asked gently. She shrugged her small shoulders. "He tells me. In my dreams." Julian knew it was fantasy, a coping mechanism for a lonely little girl who had found a face in a locket and built a world around it. But her unwavering belief in her connection to his son was both heartbreaking and strangely comforting. It was as if she were keeping a part of Leo's spirit alive, tending to a small flame that he himself had allowed to burn down to embers. That evening, he went home and did something he hadn't done since the first year of Leo's disappearance. He went into his son's bedroom. Arthur had strict instructions to keep the room exactly as it was, a perfect dust-free museum of a life cut short. The spaceship wallpaper, the row of dinosaur figurines on the shelf, the small blue jacket hanging on the back of the door. Every object was a fresh stab of pain. He walked over to the bookshelf and pulled out a worn copy of Good Night, Moon, the book he had read to Leo almost every night. He sat on the edge of the small bed, the springs groaning in the silence. He opened the book, the familiar pages falling open to the picture of the quiet old lady whispering, "Hush." He ran his fingers over the illustration, and for the first time in a long, long time, he didn't just feel the crushing weight of his loss. He felt a flicker of something else. He thought of Lily, of her unshakable faith that Leo was a lost star trying to find his way home. He thought of her sitting on the bench, listening to him read, her small head leaning against his arm. In the deepest, most painful corner of his heart, a new feeling was taking root. It was a terrifying, fragile, and utterly undeniable paternal love for the little girl at St. Jude's. The realization shook him to his core. He was betraying Leo, betraying his memory, by allowing himself to feel this way for another child. The guilt was immense, a suffocating wave. But beneath it, there was a current of warmth, of life, that he hadn't felt in years. He was caught between the ghost of the son he had lost and the very real presence of the daughter he was finding. 2 weeks into the investigation, Clara called with a breakthrough. "Maria Flores," she said, her voice tight with excitement. "I found her." Julian stood up so fast his chair scraped against the hardwood floor. "Where is she?" "She's dead, Mr. Croft," Clara said, her tone gentle but direct. "She died in a car accident 3 years ago. A single-vehicle crash on a rural highway about 200 miles from here. She was driving a stolen car, no ID on her. It took a while to connect the dots. The Jane Doe from the crash was eventually identified via fingerprints as Maria Flores." The news hit him like a physical blow. The one person who knew what had happened to Leo was gone. It was the ultimate dead end. Was there anyone else in the car? He asked, his voice hollow, dreading the answer. Yes, Clara said. There was. A child survivor. A baby girl, about a year old. She was unharmed, strapped into a car seat in the back. The police report says she was taken into the care of social services. Julian's blood ran cold. A baby girl, he repeated, his mind racing, connecting the terrible dots. Lily. That's right, Clara confirmed. The social worker's report from the time is sparse. The baby was malnourished, but otherwise healthy. They had no idea who she was, so she was entered into the system as a Jane Doe. A few weeks later, she was transferred to St. Jude's. The timing, the age. It's her. Lily was in that car with Maria Flores. So that was the connection. Maria had taken Leo, and at some point in the 2 years that followed, she had also acquired Lily. She had been raising them both. A strange, stolen family. But the report only mentioned one child survivor. What about Leo? Julian choked out the words, his throat tight with fear. He would have been 5 years old at the time of the crash. Was he in the car? There was a pause on the other end of the line. The police report is definitive, Mr. Croft, Clara said, her voice filled with a compassion he hadn't heard before. There was only one child at the scene. The baby. There was no sign of a 5-year-old boy. The car was mangled, but the coroner's report confirms there was only one other victim besides Maria. Julian sank back into his chair, the phone feeling like a lead weight in his hand. The implication was clear, a brutal, unavoidable conclusion. If Leo had been with Maria and he wasn't at the scene, there was only one logical explanation. Maria must have gotten rid of him, abandoned him somewhere, or something worse, long before the crash that had killed her. The fragile hope that had sustained him for the past month shattered, leaving behind an agony more profound than anything he had felt before. To have come so close, to have found this impossible thread connecting him to his son, only to have it lead to another dead end, another empty void, was a cruelty beyond measure. He hung up the phone, the silence of his penthouse amplifying the roaring in his ears. It was over. The trail was cold. The last person who knew the truth was dead. Leo was gone. Truly, finally gone. He didn't go to the orphanage that day, or the next. He couldn't face Lily. He couldn't look into her innocent blue eyes, eyes that had last seen his son. What had she witnessed in her short life with that woman? What horrors were locked away in her pre-verbal memory? Looking at her would be like looking at the wreckage of his own life. He walled himself up in his apartment, refusing calls from Arthur, ignoring the world outside his windows. He drank expensive scotch that tasted like ash and stared at the city lights until they blurred into a meaningless smear of color. He was back in the immediate aftermath of the disappearance, a man hollowed out by grief, a ghost in his own life. But this time, it was worse, because this time he had allowed himself to hope. After 3 days of self-imposed exile, his doorbell rang, a persistent, insistent buzz that refused to be ignored. He finally dragged himself to the door, ready to unleash his fury on whoever dared to disturb him. Standing in the hallway was Mrs. Gable from the orphanage. She held a large manila envelope in her hands, and her expression was one of gentle but firm resolve. "Forgive me for intruding, Mr. Croft," she said, her voice unwavering, "but Lily has been asking for you. She's not eating. She sits by the window all day, waiting. She thinks she did something wrong." The words were a knife in his gut. In his own selfish spiral of grief, he had forgotten about the little girl. He had forged a bond with her, created a routine, made himself a fixture in her small, fragile world. and then he had vanished, without a word. He had abandoned her, just like everyone else in her life. The shame was a physical weight. "She drew this for you," Mrs. Gable said, holding out the envelope. He took it, his hands unsteady. He opened it and pulled out a piece of construction paper. On it was a child's drawing, rendered in bright, cheerful crayon. It depicted a tall man with dark hair and a small blonde girl sitting on a bench, a large open book between them. Above them, in a sky filled with a smiling yellow sun, was a single, bright star. Written in shaky, backward letters at the bottom were the words, "Come back, Mr. Julien." He stared at the drawing, at the simple, heartfelt plea from a little girl who had come to depend on him. He had been so consumed with the son he had lost that he had been blind to the daughter he was hurting. In that moment, something inside him broke. Not the dam of grief, but the wall of selfishness he had built around his heart. His pain was real, immense, and unending. But it was not the only pain in the world. Lily's pain was real, too, and he was the cause of it. "I'll come," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll come right now." He didn't bother to change out of the rumpled clothes he'd been wearing for days. He simply followed Mrs. Gable out of the building and into the waiting car. The journey back to St. Jude's felt different this time. He wasn't going there as an investigator, a man searching for answers. He was going there as a friend, a man who had made a promise to a little girl, a promise he had carelessly broken. When he walked into the sunroom, she was there, sitting in a small chair by the window, her one-eyed bear in her lap. She was so small, so fragile. When she saw him, her face, which had been pale and withdrawn, lit up with a relief so profound it was heartbreaking. She ran to him and wrapped her small arms around his legs, burying her face in his trousers. "You came back," she mumbled into the fabric. He crouched down and gently pried her away so he could look at her. "I'm sorry, Lily," he said, his voice choked. "I'm so sorry. I should have come sooner. I wasn't feeling well." It was a lie, but it was a kinder truth than the reality of his own despair. "Are you better now?" she asked, her blue eyes searching his face. "I'm getting there," he said, and for the first time, he felt like it might be true. He hadn't found his son. He might never find him. The mystery of Leo's fate might haunt him for the rest of his days, but his obsession with the past had nearly cost him something precious in the present. He had a choice. He could continue to be the curator of his son's empty bedroom, a man defined by his loss. Or he could be Mr. Julien, the man who reads stories to a lonely little girl, the man she draws pictures for, the man she waits for at the window. He looked at Lily, at her trusting face, at the unconditional affection in her eyes. The choice was clear. "I have a new book," he said, his voice thick. "It's about a bear who finds a new family." Her eyes lit up. "Does he have one eye? Like Barnaby?" "I think he just might," Julian said, managing a small, watery smile. He sat down with her in the worn armchair, her small, warm body curled against his side, and he began to read. The words were about a fictional bear, but the story was about them. It was about two lonely souls finding each other in the wreckage of their lives, building something new out of the broken pieces. It wasn't the family he had lost, but it was a family nonetheless. And as he read, he knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that he was going to adopt her. He was going to bring Lily home. The decision, once made, felt like the most natural thing in the world. Julian set the formidable machinery of his legal team into motion. The adoption process, usually a labyrinth of bureaucracy and red tape, was streamlined by his influence and resources. Background checks were expedited, paperwork was fast-tracked. Mrs. Gable and the board of St. Jude's, having witnessed the profound bond between the billionaire and the orphan, gave their full-throated support. While the lawyers handled the legalities, Julian focused on the more important task, preparing a home and a life for Lily. He walked through his vast, silent penthouse, seeing it for the first time through a child's eyes. The minimalist art, the sharp-edged glass furniture, the cold marble floors. It was a showroom, not a home. It was a fortress designed for a man in mourning, not a playground for a little girl. He hired a renowned, child-friendly interior designer, and together they began the transformation. A spare bedroom with a stunning city view was gutted and reborn as a wonderland. The walls were painted a soft lavender, with a hand-painted mural of a whimsical forest filled with friendly animals. A canopy bed with soft, gauzy curtains became the centerpiece. A comfortable reading nook was built into a corner, complete with overflowing bookshelves and soft, oversized cushions. He took a strange, vicarious pleasure in the process, poring over catalogs of toys, clothes, and art supplies. He who had once signed off on billion-dollar deals without a second thought, now spent an hour debating the merits of different colored pencils. He was building a nest, feathering it with all the love and care he had kept locked away for 5 years. He also had Leo's room dismantled. It was the hardest thing he had ever had to do. He packed away the dinosaur figurines and the spaceship wallpaper himself, each object a fresh pang of memory. He wasn't erasing his son. He was letting him go. He was accepting that Leo lived in his heart now, not in a carefully preserved room. That space would become a playroom, a place for new memories, for new laughter. His relationship with Lily deepened during this time. He told her, in simple, careful terms, that he wanted to be her father, that he wanted her to come and live with him forever. He half expected her to be scared or overwhelmed, but she accepted it with the same simple faith she applied to everything else. "Okay," she said, as if he had just offered her a cookie. "Does that mean I can call you Daddy?" The word, so simple, so profound, sent a shockwave through him. "Yes," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Yes, you can." She began to open up to him in new ways, sharing snippets of her life before St. Jude's. Her memories were fragmented, the hazy recollections of a very young child. She remembered a woman with dark hair who was often sad and would sing her to sleep with strange, mournful songs. She remembered being in a car for a long, long time, and she remembered a boy. "He was my big brother," she said one afternoon as they sat in the orphanage garden. "He gave me his bear." Julian's blood ran cold. "Leo gave you Barnaby?" "No, not Leo," she said, shaking her head. "Leo is my angel. This was my brother. He was quiet. He never smiled. He used to hold my hand when the sad lady was crying. It was a bombshell, a piece of the puzzle he and Clara had never considered. Maria Flores had been raising 2 children. One was Lily. The other, a quiet, sad little boy, couldn't have been Leo. Leo, at that age, had been a whirlwind of energy and laughter. This was another child, another victim of Maria's fractured life. But where was he? What had happened to him? The question was a dark cloud on the horizon of his newfound happiness, a reminder that Lily's past was still shrouded in shadows. He told Clara about this new revelation. She was intrigued but cautioned him. "Memories of a child that young are notoriously unreliable, Mr. Croft. She could be confusing dreams with reality, or conflating different people. We have no evidence of a second boy." He knew she was right, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Lily was telling the truth. For now, however, his focus was on her, on their future. The day he brought her home was one of brilliant, crystalline sunshine. She walked into the penthouse, her small hand in his, her eyes wide with wonder. She ran from room to room, her delighted squeals echoing in the high-ceilinged space. She skidded to a halt in her new bedroom, her jaw dropping at the sight of the mural and the canopy bed. She turned to him, her face shining with a joy so pure it almost brought him to his tears. "It's for me?" she whispered, as if she couldn't believe it. "All of it?" "All of it," he confirmed, his heart swelling. That night, he tucked her into her new bed, the soft glow of a star-shaped nightlight illuminating her face. He read her a story, just as he had done so many times on the orphanage bench. When he finished, she snuggled down under the covers. "Good night, Daddy," she said, her voice already thick with sleep. He leaned down and kissed her forehead, inhaling the sweet, clean scent of her hair. "Good night, Lily," he whispered, "my little star." As he walked out of her room, closing the door softly behind him, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known was possible. His life was no longer a monument to his grief. It was a home. The hole in his heart was still there, a scar that would never fully fade, but it was no longer a gaping void. It was being filled, slowly but surely, by the light of a little girl who had taught him how to be a father again. The following weeks were a journey of discovery for both of them. Julian learned the rhythms of life with a child again, the early morning cartoons, the battles over brushing teeth, the endless stream of questions about how the world worked. Lily, in turn, began to shed the shell of institutional caution she had worn for so long. She blossomed in the warmth of his love and attention, her laughter becoming a frequent and welcome sound in the once silent penthouse. They fell into a comfortable, happy routine. But the past had not been fully laid to rest. One rainy Saturday afternoon, while sorting through the last of the boxes from Leo's old room, Julian found something he had forgotten about. A small, handheld digital video camera. It felt like a relic from another lifetime. He charged it, and with a sense of trepidation, he turned it on. The screen flickered to life, and there was Leo's face, grinning at him from 5 years ago. It was footage from their last family vacation, a trip to a beach house a month before he disappeared. Julian's finger hovered over the delete button, his first instinct to shut it off, to not put himself through the pain. But then he thought of Lily. She knew Leo only as a static image in a locket, a guardian angel in her dreams. Perhaps she deserved to see the boy he really was. With a deep breath, he called her into the study. "I want to show you something," he said, his voice gentle. "I want to show you, Leo." He pressed play. The tiny screen was filled with images of a vibrant, happy little boy. Leo, his face smeared with chocolate ice cream, laughing as he ran from the waves. Leo, his small body concentrated in effort, building a lopsided sandcastle. Leo, his voice high-pitched and excited, narrating a tour of the seashells he had collected. Lily watched, utterly mesmerized. She sat cross-legged on the floor, her chin resting in her hands, her eyes glued to the screen. She didn't say a word. She just watched, her expression unreadable. The final clip on the camera was from the last day of their trip. It was a close-up of Leo, his hair still damp from the ocean, talking directly to the camera, which Julian was holding. "When I grow up," the little boy on the screen announced with great solemnity, "I'm going to be a big brother, and I'm going to teach my little sister how to build the best sandcastles in the whole world. And I'll protect her from the scary crabs." The video ended. The screen went black. The silence in the room was absolute. Julian felt the tears he had been holding back finally spill over, tracking silently down his cheeks. Lily remained motionless for a long moment. Then she turned to look at him, her own eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "He was waiting for me," she whispered, her voice filled with a quiet awe. And in that moment, Julian understood. The fantasy she had created wasn't a fantasy at all. It was something deeper, a connection that defied logic and explanation. Her guardian angel wasn't just a face in a locket. It was the spirit of a little boy who had wanted nothing more than to be a big brother. A month later, as the final adoption papers were being signed in a judge's chambers, Clara Sterling arrived, unannounced, and looking flustered for the first time since Julian had met her. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, pulling him aside while Lily was happily showing the judge her one-eyed bear. "But you need to see this." She handed him her tablet. On the screen was a scanned document, a faded, coffee-stained piece of paper. "It's a social worker's case file," Clara explained, her voice low and urgent. "The original one from the crash scene 3 years ago. It was misfiled, buried in a box of cold cases in a county warehouse. I only found it because I put in a blanket request for every piece of paper associated with the Jane Doe, Maria Flores." Julian scanned the document. It was a handwritten intake form detailing the discovery of the baby girl, Lily. But then his eyes fell on a paragraph near the bottom, a section for additional notes. The social worker had written, "Second child present at scene, male, approx. 5 years old, in severe shock, non-verbal. Ran from wreckage into woods before first responders could secure him. Search of immediate area yielded negative results. Assumed to be local child who witnessed crash and fled in terror." Julian's knees felt weak. He had to read the sentence 3 times for it to sink in. A second child, a 5-year-old boy. He ran. He had been there. Leo had been alive. "Why wasn't this in the police report?" Julian demanded, his voice a raw whisper. "Because by the time the police arrived, he was gone," Clara said. The social worker was the first on the scene after a passing motorist called it in. In the chaos of securing the baby and dealing with the fatality, her report of a second child who had vanished was treated as a secondary concern. The police did a cursory search, found nothing, and assumed the traumatized social worker was mistaken or that the boy had simply run home. Her follow-up reports were lost in the system. It was a catastrophic failure of bureaucracy. His mind was reeling, a chaotic storm of emotions. Leo hadn't died. He hadn't been abandoned before the crash. He had been there. Terrified and alone, he had run from the wreckage, from the only mother he had known for 2 years, and vanished into the woods. "Is there anything else?" Julian asked, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. "Yes," Clara said, swiping to another page on the tablet. It was a follow-up memo from the same social worker, dated a week later. It was addressed to her supervisor and conveyed a desperate sense of urgency. It read, "Further to my report, a local farmer has contacted me. He says a couple who lives deep in the woods, completely off-grid, mentioned to him at the general store that they found a little boy by the side of the road on the day of the accident. They believe he was a gift from God. They are the Millers. No phone, no official address, just a general location in the Briarwood sector. I believe this is the missing boy from the crash. I strongly urge immediate follow-up." Julian looked at Clara, his eyes wide with a terrifying, electrifying hope. And nothing," Clara said, her voice laced with frustration. "The memo was never acted upon. The supervisor it was addressed to went on medical leave the next day and never returned. The file was buried. The Millers were never investigated. For 3 years, that little boy has been living with them." Julian's world, which had just begun to settle into a new, happy equilibrium, was thrown into violent upheaval once again. Leo was alive. He was out there. A lost boy, found by strangers, living a life Julian couldn't possibly imagine, while he, his father, had been mourning his death. He looked through the glass of the judge's chambers at Lily, who was now explaining the intricate social hierarchy of her stuffed animals. His daughter. He had a daughter. And now, impossibly, he might also have his son. The judge signed the final decree with a flourish. Lily was officially his. He walked back into the room, his mind a whirlwind, and scooped her up into a hug. She was real. She was his, a solid, comforting weight in his arms. He held her tight, the anchor in his storm. "Lily," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't possibly understand. "We have to go on a trip. We have to go and find your brother." The journey to the Briarwood sector was like traveling back in time. The sleek limousine gave way to a rugged four-wheel-drive SUV driven by Clara. Paved highways turned to gravel roads, then to deeply rutted dirt tracks that wound their way through dense, ancient forests. Cell service vanished. The world grew quiet, save for the crunch of tires on dirt and the rustle of leaves in the wind. Lily sat in the back, strapped into her car seat, looking out the window with wide, curious eyes. She seemed untroubled by the sudden journey, accepting it with her usual quiet grace. Julian had explained to her in the simplest terms he could manage that they were going to find the little boy she remembered, the quiet brother from her hazy past. He didn't use Leo's name, not yet. He didn't want to layer his own desperate hopes onto her fragmented memories. He needed to protect them both from a potential heartbreak. The general location provided by the farmer was a crude, hand-drawn map. They spent hours navigating by landmarks, a twisted oak tree, a collapsed stone wall, a fork in a creek. The forest seemed to swallow them whole, the trees pressing in on all sides. Julian felt a primal fear he hadn't experienced before. His son had been lost out here, a terrified 5-year-old, alone in this vast, intimidating wilderness. How had he survived? Finally, after a full day of searching, they saw it. A thin curl of smoke rising above the treetops. They followed it to a small, secluded clearing. In the center stood a rustic, hand-built log cabin. A large, overgrown vegetable garden sat to one side, and a few chickens pecked at the dirt near a simple wooden coop. It was a world away from Julian's penthouse, a different century altogether. A man and a woman, both weathered and worn by a life of hard work, came out onto the porch as they pulled up. They were the Millers, Julian presumed. They looked at the strange, expensive vehicle and its occupants with suspicion, their faces grim. Julian got out of the car, followed by Clara. He had instructed Lily to stay inside for now. "Mr. and Mrs. Miller?" he asked, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. The man, tall and gaunt with a long gray beard, just nodded, his eyes narrowed. "We've come to talk to you about the boy," Julian said, getting straight to the point. The woman, her face a road map of wrinkles, clutched the porch railing. "He's our son," she said, her voice fierce. "A gift from the Lord. We found him, wandering and lost. We saved him." "You took him," Clara corrected, her tone sharp. "There was an accident. He had a family. A father who has been searching for him for 5 years." The Millers exchanged a look of panicked denial. It was clear they had convinced themselves of their own narrative, that they were righteous saviors, not kidnappers. They had lived in their isolated world for so long, disconnected from the news and the frantic searches, that their delusion had become their reality. "He's happy here," the man insisted. "He doesn't remember anything from before. This is his home." "That's not your decision to make," Julian said, his voice rising, the carefully controlled facade of the calm businessman beginning to crack. "Where is he?" And then he saw him. A boy emerged from behind the cabin, carrying a small pail of water. He was 10 years old, wiry and tanned, with shaggy, sun-bleached brown hair that fell into his eyes. He wore patched overalls and no shoes. He moved with a quiet, cautious grace. He stopped when he saw the strangers, his eyes the exact shade of melted chocolate, eyes Julian saw every time he looked in the mirror, widening in alarm. It was him. It was Leo. The world stopped turning. The air left Julian's lungs. His legs felt like they might give out from under him. This was his son, his beautiful, lost boy, standing 20 feet away from him, looking at him with the eyes of a stranger. He was no longer the laughing, carefree child from the park. He was a different person, shaped by a different life. A quiet, watchful boy who looked more like a forest creature than a city child. Julian took a step forward, his hand outstretched. "Leo?" he whispered, the name a prayer on his lips. The boy flinched at the name, a flicker of something, confusion, recognition, in his eyes. He looked at Julian, then at the Millers, his expression lost. Julian's heart broke. His son didn't know him. The last 5 years, the years of growth and change, had been stolen from them. He was a stranger to his own child. He fumbled in his pocket and pulled out his wallet. He took out a small, worn photograph he had carried with him every single day for 5 years. It was a picture of him and Leo, taken at a birthday party, both of them wearing ridiculous paper hats and grinning at the camera. He held it out. "This is us, Leo," he said, his voice thick with unshed tears. "You and me. Your dad." The boy took a hesitant step closer, his eyes fixed on the photograph. He reached out a small, dirt-smudged hand and took it. He stared at it for a long time, his brow furrowed in concentration. The Millers watched, their faces a mixture of fear and sorrow, the reality of their situation finally dawning on them. Just then, the car door opened. Lily, unable to wait any longer, climbed out. She had her one-eyed bear, Barnaby, clutched in her hand. She saw the boy and stopped, her blue eyes wide. The boy looked up from the photograph and saw her. Their eyes met across the clearing. A silence fell, thick with unspoken memories, with the ghosts of a shared, traumatic past. Lily took a step forward. "My brother," she whispered, the words barely audible. The boy's face crumpled. The name, the face, the memory. It all came rushing back in a confusing, overwhelming flood. He looked from Lily to the photograph, and then to the tall, sad-eyed man who was crying silently. "Daddy?" he asked, the word a question, a memory, a hope. Julian couldn't speak. He could only nod, his entire body shaking with the force of his emotion. Leo ran. He closed the distance between them and threw his arms around Julian's waist, burying his face in his father's shirt. He was real. He was warm. He was home. Julian wrapped his arms around his son, holding him tight, his face buried in the boy's sun-bleached hair. And he sobbed. He wept for the 5 lost years, for the pain and the grief and the endless empty nights. He wept for the joy of this impossible, miraculous reunion. Lily walked over and timidly joined the embrace, her small arms wrapping around both her father and her brother. The 3 of them stood there in the clearing, a broken, scattered family, finally made whole again. Clara Sterling watched from a distance, a rare, genuine smile on her face. She would deal with the Millers, with the legalities and the consequences. But for now, in this moment, she was simply a witness to a miracle. Julian Croft, the billionaire who had everything and nothing, now had it all. He had his son. He had his daughter. He had his family. He had his world back. And as he held his children, he knew that his life, once defined by a tragic loss, would now be defined by this extraordinary, improbable love. The journey home was not a return to the past, but the first step into a new future, a future brighter than any he had ever dared to imagine.